welcome back to the Frigg'n Heathens podcast. We hope you're ready because this episode is girthy. We're digging into the Prose Edda, one of the most important sources we have on Norse mythology. And we're going to be talking about how we can use it and how maybe we shouldn't use it for reconstructing heathen religious practices. We're your hosts. I'm Moxie. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them.
And I'm Astrid. My pronouns are she, her. And last time we talked about the CRAAP Test and what it was. It was a way of evaluating sources, currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose. Fun acronym, good times. And this time we're going to be putting Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda under the lens of the CRAAP Test and really digging into why it's good to use and what parts of it are kind of touchy and what's fun about it.
Yeah. So to dive in, what is the Prose Edda? Never heard of it. No, the Prose Edda is one of the major surviving sources for Norse mythology and lore. It was written as like a textbook for Icelandic skaldic poetry. It contains 4 sections. So the prologue is a euhemerized account of the Norse gods as immigrants from Troy, as was the fashion at the time.
So weird.
It's really strange. The Gylfaginning is a sort of a question and answer format info on the Norse mythology and cosmology. And then this one I always have trouble saying, the Skaldskaparmal.
Yes.
Yay! It's starts off with a little more of the question and answer, and then it gives lists of kennings and heiti. And kennings and heiti we'll go into a little more later. The last section is the Hatatal, I think. It discusses the composition of traditional skaldic poetry. And the reason it's so important, for us today is, for one thing, it contains the myths of the gods. Some deities are only mentioned by name with very little extra information, but they can only be found here in the Prose Edda. The lists of kennings and heiti alone give insight into the relationships and associations of the deities. So we will be talking about the Prose Edda in regards to reconstruction after we do the CRAAP test.
Yep. And to actually practice what we preach on our little podcast, we're going to be using 2 separate translations to go over the Prose Edda to show the differences between them. Hopefully it's not going to be too insane for people to follow along with us, but we're going to try. We're going to try real hard. So we're going to do Fox and Anderson translations. Both are available for free online. We'll have links in the episode description for anyone who wants to look at them and for easy access. Fox is also a fairly popular paperback as well. It's the Everyman Edda from Everyman Publishing.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
And for ease of understanding, I will be discussing the Anderson translation.
And I'll cover Fox. And Fox is spelled Faulkes, just so that everybody knows. I could be butchering names. That's going to happen a lot. So
yeah.
Neither one of us are fluent in Old Norse, so that could also be an issue.
It will be a common theme, I'm sure. We'll get corrected on our pronunciation a lot, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. And please, if you know how to say something correctly and we are saying it incorrectly, leave us a comment.
Absolutely.
Saying, you fucked this up. Can you not?
Happy to learn.
Yep.
Let's look at some background on Snorri Sturluson.
Okay, so Snorri Sturluson was born in 1179 in Iceland and died in 1241. He was assassinated in his house, which was super. There's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. But he was very involved in politics, both in Iceland and in Norway. He was famous for his poetic skill, even from a young age. By age 40, he was Iceland's law speaker 2 separate times, held 7 chieftaincies over his lifetime, and was literally the most powerful man in Iceland at the time. Despite all of his power and wealth, though, he wasn't a very good Viking by most standards. He was more likely to pay a fine than to fight a duel. He was a well-known lawyer and poet his entire life, though, as well as a historian. He was the guy who wrote the Heimskringla, which is the history of the kings of Norway. Big old girthy book.
It's a huge, huge book. We should also mention Snorri is, of course, for those of you who are following along, the author of the Prose Edda.
Yes.
Important to mention.
Yes, he is. Or at least we think he is.
Yes. And you've been reading a book about him.
Yes. It's a really interesting book. There'll be a link to it in the description. It's called The Song of the Vikings by Nancy Marie Brown. And it's about Snorri Sturluson's life, and it's very interesting and it's very engaging and fun. But yes, Snorri Sturluson is the one who wrote the Prose Edda, or at least compiled it at some point. So we're going to talk a little bit about him and the Prose Edda, which could arguably be what made him the most famous.
Yeah, I'd say so. It's the source of constant joy and frustration from every modern heathen.
Yes, it's super fun. And it's a weird source, because most of the stuff that we would have from this time period is kind of in that weird in-between place between prose and poetry, because at this point in history, a lot of Norway and most of mainland Europe was doing away with poetry as the main source of recording history and entertainment and replacing it with more prose forms of stuff. And because Snorri was also really into being hip and cool, he probably thought that putting the myths he'd learned in poetry into prose would gain him some favor and some more fame, even though he was already, super well known everywhere.
He seemed to be fond of such things.
He liked to be painted as a heroic Viking, even though he was definitely not.
So with that, we'll dive into the Prose Edda CRAAP Test. It's a Prose Edda, also called the Younger Edda, the Poetic Edda being the Elder Edda. So the first part of our CRAAP test is C for currency. It was written by the Icelandic scholar and historian, or compiled, as we said, around 1220. It's likely it took all the way up until Snorri's death in 1241-ish to finish it. It survives in 4 known manuscripts and 3 fragments compiled from about 1300 to about 1600.
Yeah, it would be considered a secondary source, like if you listened to our first episode, since it's prose that was based on poems. Although it's become commonly accepted that Snorri is the author of the Prose Edda because his name is tied directly to it in a passage in a 14th century manuscript. It's also really often looked at as a primary source because it is the first time we have these myths written down in prose form. So a lot of authors and historians and heathen reconstructionists look at it as a primary source. So in the first translation we're going to look at, one of the translations we're going to look at is by Anthony Fawkes, which was first published in 1987. And it's available as a free PDF through the Viking Society for Northern Research via Mimmirsbrunir, which is a website. And we're going to have a link to that.
The second translation is by Rasmus Bjorn Andersen. It was published in 1880. Original copyright owned by S.C. Griggs and Company, printed by the Henry O. Shepard Company of Chicago. Now it's in the public domain and available for free on Project Gutenberg.
Yes. So these 2 translations are roughly 100 years apart. So there's a lot of really interesting differences between them that proves why you need to do more research than just read one thing as a heathen reconstructionist. The next little bit in our CRAAP test is R, and that's relevance. Why is the Prose Edda relevant? I feel like this is a big duh moment, but at the same time, not everyone has been a heathen for 12 years like me. Yeah. But it's super important. It's really important because, again, it's one of the first places that we've been able to find, and sometimes it's the only place we have a lot of these myths written down and these stories written down. The Prose Edda was written for Christians, generally, because by that point, Iceland was Christian, and so was the vast majority of Europe. Again, this is, the 1200s. It was also aimed at people who were interested in literary forms. Again, Snorri was a big poet. He was really into history, and a lot of history at that point was preserved in poetry and skaldic poetry. And we'll talk a little bit more about skaldic poetry in a minute, but one of the reasons Snorri wrote the Poetic Edda was to preserve and educate on those forms of skaldic poetry, which is very Icelandic and some Norwegian, like Norse in origin. And since Moxie is our resident poet, you want to talk about skaldic poetry?
Yeah, skaldic poetry is a type of poetic verse that was used mostly by the aristocracy, but it was also among the common people. It started in Norway, but after the conversion of Norway to Christianity, most skaldic poetry shifted to Iceland, and it was used to preserve history, including the lives of kings and heroes. You'll see poetry used a lot in a lot of the sagas and stuff like that. You'll see representations of that. Like most art used to preserve history, it was also a political tool. You would have court skalds, and they would praise the king or jarl of where they were with great poems that were tales of his great exploits. So you have to take some of it with a grain of salt. You know, they wouldn't say something outright because who would lie to someone to their face about what they did? But to make it just sound a whole lot more interesting than it was, and maybe way more brave, you know, that's not out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah, like you want somebody to zhuzh it up a little bit so that you look good in front of your subjects. Like, yeah. You don't want to look like a ding-dong.
Yeah. Studying skaldic poetry is really going to be a whole thing unto itself. So we won't go into like too much detail because that's not really the purpose of what we're doing right here.
Yeah,
it's even too much. It was largely Snorri's purpose.
Yeah, there's too much going on. Yeah. You can't deal with it.
It is really interesting, though, and we'll drop some further reading in the description.
Yes. Another big reason why Snorri's Edda is so important as far as just history goes, and especially for heathens, is that pretty much anything that you find about Norse mythology now links back to the Edda. Whether it's the poetic Edda or the prose Edda, almost all of them link back to here. Wagner and his Five Rings was really inspired by Snorri's Edda. Hitler, unfortunately, was also really inspired by the Edda, because those Norse myths were one of the only places those Norse myths were written down. So you gotta give him some credit for that, as much as, you know, it's annoying.
Yeah, and we'll be getting more into kind of history of heathenry and how some of these things came to be and all of that in a future episode. So we won't go too far into a lot of that. But yeah, it is a whole thing. It is a whole thing. What came after the Prose Edda is a whole thing.
Yeah, because it deserves its own episode altogether.
The next section of our CRAAP test is authority. And when you're looking at a translated text like this, you have to look at the original, who is attributed as the author, so Snorri, but also the authority of the translator. Who's the person doing the translating? What are their credentials? All of that. So we're going to go through all of this now with authority.
Yes. So again, we're going to talk about Snorri for a minute. He was a poet and a politician. Grew up hearing and reading skaldic poetry about the gods and entities that his ancestors worshipped. He grew up in Iceland and was schooled in Iceland. So over 200 years after the Christian conversion was when this happened. Iceland is notorious, though, for sticking to its traditions even after the Christian conversion. And they're still that way. Like, you still hear stuff about, like, highways getting diverted because of the hidden folk living in a rock. Yeah, so like you still see these things happen, and Iceland is very much about its traditions.
Which is really cool, I think.
It is really cool. So it wouldn't be far-fetched to imagine that, you know, a lot of those stories were stories that Snorri grew up listening to and hearing and telling. He was also really interested in history, wrote the Heimskringla, the history of the kings of Norway. He was very familiar with prior histories, poetry, stories, myths, all of that, like written down and by word of mouth. So he was he's about as authoritative as you can get from that time period, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he did know what he was talking about. It's just he was kind of selective with what he chose to record.
Uh-huh. Just a bit. But like the first translator we're going to look through is Anthony Fox. He was born in 1937. At the time of his publication, he was the professor of Old Icelandic at the University of Birmingham. He studied Old Icelandic and medieval English at Balliol College in Oxford and was a lecturer for 10 years there. 10 years at Birkbeck College in University of London. He got a doctorate from the University of Reykjavik in 1981. He was the president of the Viking Society for Northern Research from 1986 to 88 and joint editor of the Society's saga book and text series. So this man is like a huge nerd for this shit. And it's like,
absolutely.
Yeah. So you know he knows what he's talking about, at least to a degree, at least from like the historical perspective and the language perspective, which is good.
Yes.
And he was also awarded the Knight's Cross of the Icelandic Order of the Falcon for services to Icelandic scholarship in 1992. So, yeah, he even got an award for knowing shit.
Yeah, the Viking Society for Northern Research that he was part of, that was an outgrowth from a student academic group at the University of Georgia in Athens, but it's not actually affiliated with any academic institution. They're still putting out works and doing things like that, and providing this information for free on the internet, just to help make academic research into these subjects more readily available.
Yay.
The second translator we're looking at is Anderson. Rasmus Bjorn Anderson, born January 12th, 1846, died March 2nd, 1936. Anderson was a graduate of Luther College and the University of Wisconsin. He was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 1867 to 1883, so during the time period that he produced the work, which was 1880. While there, he was the founding head of the Department of Scandinavian Studies, which was the oldest such department in an American university. He also was the originator of Leif Erikson Day. He really, really pushed for that. And he was just it's super important to him that people acknowledge that the Vikings were here first. So he's where that came from. He also founded the publication company, the Norröna Society, which focused on republishing translation of texts devoted to the, quote, history and romance of Northern Europe. And this was during the Victorian era. And there was a lot of romanticization and all of that of Germanic culture going on at the time. So it was very popular. Now, it's important to note, the Norröna Society that Anderson founded is not to be confused with the modern heathen org of the same name. They
that's a good point.
Are a folkist group. Their website has red flags everywhere. They talk about the ancestral traditions of Northern Europe and our folk, and it's just all over the place. They make it very clear what their goal is, and it's not inclusive heathenry.
It's not a good sign.
No. So the next part of our CRAAP test is accuracy. How accurate is the Prose Edda? Is the Prose Edda accurate?
No. No. It's not. But how do we know if something about, like, because we're coming at this from a religious perspective. Like, we're coming at this from a spiritual point of view. How do we know if Snorri's stories of the gods are the real ones? Do we know? Does it matter? Like, that's something to think about, but like at the same time, no, it's not. It's not. Because there's so many different ways to look at myth, and there were so many stories and poems and other myths that Snorri pulled from to make the Prose Edda that there was no way to record them all. Like, he had to pick and choose which ones he wanted to put in there. And in Song of the Vikings by Nancy Marie Brown, she says that Snorri took what he liked and retold them, making things up when need be. And I mean, if you have conflicting stories, like, a lot of the stuff in the Prose Edda does contradict itself just because that's the nature of myth. But if you have two different stories and you can only tell one story, you have to pick which one you want to tell. So he had to pick and choose some stuff. So some stuff by default is gone somewhere.
It would be really nice to see different variations on the myths and how they would have been viewed at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it would have been. Again, wistful heathen wishes.
Yes, if only.
If only. If only someone thought to write it down. Damn it. Yeah, so like a lot of those stories that Snorri wrote down in the Prose Edda, like some of them, like the stories of Skathi and Njord, how the gods got their famous tools, like Mjolnir, Draupnir, Gugnir. Basically, all the stuff about Asgard geography is entirely Snorri's invention, or at the least, cannot be found in any other sources. So you sort of have to take that with a grain of salt, too. Like, is this the only thing that people believed at the time? Probably not.
Yeah, probably
based upon what we know from the Poetic Edda, and just from how people are in general.
Another point with the accuracy is that we have to take biases into account. Snorri was a Christian, and a lot of what he wrote in the Prose Edda could be seen as bias. Ragnarok, mostly the parts where all the gods die, and Baldur comes back, this shining hero, to rule over a new Asgard and a new Earth. Sounds really familiar.
Yeah, it does. I just can't put my finger on.
Yeah.
Something about resurrection and coming back from the dead.
It's a mystery. We'll have to come back to it later.
Yeah. Someone let us know, please. Yeah, it's just so weird. Like, he's very clearly a Christian, and he's writing from a Christian perspective. Like, it mentions Noah's flood in there. And like Moxie said earlier, the gods of Asgard are from Troy in the Prose Edda. They were from Troy, and they tricked primitive people into worshipping them, according to the Edda.
Yeah, that's always lovely. Love when that word gets rolled out.
Yeah, they didn't know any better. You know?
No.
They were just misguided pagans. But that was a thing that people were doing. Everybody wanted to link their lineage to Troy because that was like the epitome of classical lineage was Troy.
Yeah, it kind of lended some credence to your culture if you could link it back there somehow, even if you had to make it up.
Yeah, and that happened a lot.
It also helped get past the Christian censorship of what would then have been a Christianized government if you didn't say, hey, these are the gods of our ancestors. And instead you said, no, these are just people who tricked people and that there were nothing to be worshipped. And now we're going to talk about them from here on out like they're actually gods.
That's so true, though. I never really, I mean, I guess I knew that, but I never really thought about it in that way, because that's very true. Like, they couldn't just be like, hey, we're going to talk about our pagan ancestors and what they believed. It's like, no, we've got to make sure that we make them look like they were just sad and misguided pagans.
And Snorri was a politician, so he would have known very well how to walk that line and what would have been best for him in that scenario.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. With accuracy in mind, as far as like the Fox translation is concerned, it's considered the most complete compilation of the Prose Edda that we have now. I mean, it was published in 1987. It's relatively recent for something like this. The paperback version and the PDF both contain text summaries at the back that are really helpful when trying to parse through all of the language and all of the multiple storyline threads that keep starting and stopping. It's very confusing. There are no footnotes or endnotes, though, which is kind of annoying, but there is an index, which is helpful.
On the website that we'll link to below the Mimmersbrunner, there are notes that he has on the site. For the Anderson translation, as far as completeness goes, we have it's snippets it's described as, but it's more complete than anything else to that date. On page 9 in the introduction, Anderson says, the present volume contains all of the younger Edda that can possibly be of any importance to English readers. Really? You sure about that?
Because it was published 1880. Yeah. So it's like you had... Oh man, no.
I want everything. I want to be able to read all of it in context and understand fully. So yeah, there's more of interest than just snippets. But it was more complete than anything else that had been written to that date.
Yeah, up to that point, that was the best one that they had.
Up to 1880. So you see how we're getting more and more complete translations as time progresses. Mm-hmm. Another issue with, it does include translator endnotes. They're not very extensive endnotes, but there are some there. I would prefer a few more translator notes, honestly.
We always want more notes.
I like notes. I would like half the page to be notes, like in footnotes.
More notes, please.
All the notes. But with Anderson's, there is some censorship involved. It being Victorian times, there was a lot of things you just really, it would not have been appropriate to go into. Notably, for example, the story of Njord and Skathi's wedding. You know, one of the things Skathi asked for was for the Aesir to make her laugh. Mm-hmm. And Loki obliged. And the way that is described in Anderson's translation is, then Loki tied one end of a string fast to the beard of a goat and the other around his own body. And one pulled this way and the other that, and both of them shrieked out loud. I think it's written a little differently in the Fox translation, if I'm not mistaken.
his own body is his testicles. Like,
yeah, that's kind of an important distinction.
Like, testicles are called testicles in the Fox translation of the Skullscarper Ball. And part of that, I think, too, is because not only was Anderson writing in, 1880, it was also in America in 1880.
Yeah.
So, like, Americans are very weird anyway. We are very weird about that stuff. Yeah, I don't understand it. It's very strange.
Bodies. Which is weird about bodies. I don't know why.
But like there's just something better about the story when you know that Loki tied one end of a string to a goat and the other around his balls. Like it's just like it's so much better. It's so much better when you have that in there. That mental image has a lot more oomph.
It does. It's a lot more oomph too. It does. It does. You got to admit.
Oh, lots of the references are to beings or kennings or places that would have been commonly known at the time and place that the Eddas were written. We don't know a lot of those things. It makes it really frustrating to get through sometimes because we are not familiar with things that the way that people in those historical times would have been familiar with them.
Yeah. It didn't seem necessary, I'm sure, to Snorri to record it because he was writing for poetry. It was basically a textbook on skaldic poetry. And so he wrote down like the names of gods or goddesses and what you might associate as their domains to explain the way that words were used in kennings so that poets would have the vocabulary needed to understand and reproduce skaldic poetry. So it wasn't important to him to include any surviving myths.
Yes. Yeah.
It was unnecessary for his intended purpose.
Why
so
would it be?
That's really frustrating sometimes.
Yeah. And like as far as the translations goes and accuracy, a lot of it is there's just some differences in spellings of names. Like in the Fox version, Bori is spelled Bori. In Anderson, it's Bore. Emir versus Emer. I know that that's not helpful at all. YMIR versus YMER, like just pretty small differences like that. It's pretty easy to tell who they're talking about because the differences are minute, but it's still something to take note of.
So the next section in our CRAAP test is purpose, and we've talked about this already. The purpose was to be a poetry manual and to preserve stories and kennings and skaldic poetry for cultural heritage conservation purposes. It was written because he was wanting to preserve the traditional forms, poetic forms of Iceland. Many of the kennings would be difficult, if not impossible, to understand without knowing the myths behind them.
So, like, what a kenning is confusing for a lot of people. It's kind of once you know what it is, you're like, oh, okay, I know exactly what that is. But it's like a metaphorical word or phrase. It's like a figure of speech, basically. It's tricky because most of the kennings used in Old Norse poetry, like we talked about before, would have been commonly understood then. But a lot of that context, like that cultural, societal context, we don't have now. And like a good example, a good modern one was brown noser for someone who's a suck-up. Or an ambulance chaser for like a lawyer who works mostly on injury defense cases. If you used ambulance chaser now, everyone in the room would know what you were talking about. If you used ambulance chaser 500 years ago, no one would know what the hell you were talking about. What's an ambulance? Why are you chasing it? What is it? Like, what? It doesn't make any sense. So a lot of those kennings in Old Norse myth and mythology and poetry and prose and all of this stuff are similar to that.
They're culturally dependent.
Yes. We don't have that context anymore. So a lot of it gets kind of misinterpreted or just not interpreted at all because it's confusing as shit. But some of my favorite ones from the Prose Edda, one of them is corpse dew. And that's a kenning for blood.
Oh, that's good.
I know, isn't it? It's metal as hell.
It is.
And battle twig for a sword.
Battle twig. I love battle that twig.
Yeah, I know. It's very weird. And I love kennings. Kennings are great. And a lot of kennings will show up when you see stuff about gods or places, different entities like Valkyries. Yeah, they'll show up a lot. Kennings are important.
So the next step would be looking at the purpose of the different translations, because different translators will have kind of different motives when they're doing their translation. So let's dive into that.
Yeah. Okay. So Fox is still alive, by the way. As far as we know, he was really hard to find a biography on him. But we are assuming he's still alive. He would be in his 80s now.
Can find no records of his death.
Yes, so he's probably still alive. His purpose wasn't really talked about in the intro to his translation, but I'm assuming it was probably to have a more updated and complete translation of the Prose Edda, just because he was a professor of Old Icelandic and was a serious academic and scholar at the time. So having that makes sense. And there wasn't a better one. So he's like, fuck it, I'll do it myself.
Yeah. And Anderson now is a different story altogether. This was there again in the 1880s. There's a lot of romanticization of Nordic culture and all of that. You know, he was really big on that, pushing for Leif Erikson Day. From the preface, a quote from him: "Well aware that our work has many imperfections and begging our readers to deal generously with our shortcomings, we send the book out into the world with the hope that it may aid some young son or daughter of Odin to find his way to the fountains of Urd and Mimir and to Idun's rejuvenating apples. The son must not squander, but husband wisely what his father has accumulated. The race must cherish and hold fast and add to the thought that the past has bequeathed to it. Thus does it grow greater and richer with each new generation. The past is the mirror that reflects the future." So we see oof. Oof. Oof.
Like I'm torn because there's some good shit in there,
but it's
but also not so much.
The race and our ancestors.
Yeah, that's where it lost me.
Yeah, that's where he lost me too.
That's where it lost me.
It's very, very much about creating this or recreating sort of a white supremacist cultural identity. I mean, white supremacy was kind of in vogue at the time. Not that it's really ever truly fallen out of favor.
Yeah, and I'm not going to assume that it was like a malicious intent. Yeah. It was just, that's what they did at the time. And it was, let's bring these stories back into the fore and have, this, what was it, young son or daughter of Odin?
Yeah.
To find these stories again. Like, I understand that. I get it. And I like that idea. But once it got linked to race, nah.
No.
Nope, not so much.
So that's our CRAAP test. Now, from there, what do? We have a good idea of kind of where we stand, what things are maybe reliable, what things are not, how questionable the sources are, and how much we have to scrutinize it a little more carefully in some places. So now we need to look at how do we adapt what we find in the Prose Edda to reconstruction of heathen practices. So we said it contains stories of the gods, or at least some versions of stories of the gods. So it is a good place to start with like associated sort of areas of the gods and what they represent or were associated with. We find in the Prose Edda names of goddesses associated with Frigg and their domains. We have few or no surviving myths associated with a lot of these goddesses, and the Prose Edda helps us establish a basis for praxis, including them. For example, the goddess Var hears the oaths of men and women, and so you could reasonably invoke Var as a keeper of oaths, but, don't make oaths. Just putting that out there. We may cover oaths later, and the pitfalls of them historically in the sources. they never turn out well.
Yeah, don't
Spoiler.
Make oaths. No, not in a single fucking saga. Not a single one.
Yeah, don't do that. But that is a way that you can see to associate a deity in modern praxis with just the barest mention. It's like a sentence on Var, Now, it's important to note personal experience in reconstruction is a big part of it.
Yes, it was.
It can take trial and error to find the way for you to connect with these deities, especially when you have less information to go on. You kind of have to just take what information you have and pick something and go with it. Try that. And then if that doesn't work, revise as experience informs your understanding. Mm-hmm. For example, with Sif, her hair, it was used as a kenning for fire. So a lot of people interpret Sif as like a hearth goddess and associated with like fire in the home and hearth because of that. And also with her hair being shaved off and then coming back full golden locks, she's often represented with like the harvest and the grain being shorn and then, coming back.
Yes. It's an interesting image to compare the two. I like that.
Yeah. And I've played around with that a little in my associations with Sif. I've been attempting to form reciprocity with Sif and struggling a little. I don't really connect as much with the fire aspect of her right now. So working on the wheat and the harvest and seeing if that yields a little better results for me. So, and it's UPG, it's different for everybody sometimes. And it doesn't mean that either one is right or wrong. She could be associated with both things. And just like you have friends that you may do like D&D with, but you don't necessarily talk about, clothes or whatever. And you might do that with another friend, so there might be one aspect of a deity that kind of you connect with a little more closely and someone else connects with another one of their aspects. So conflicting UPG isn't necessarily a problem.
No. And especially when most of these deities, we don't know a whole lot about them. Like, we don't know, and we never will know for sure. So all we have is our own experiences with them to really nail anything down. And even then, what I see with Sif could be something completely different than what you do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And that's totally fine, because that's likely what it was like, 1,000 years ago, too.
Yeah, just village to village. There was probably different associations.
So, like, another one of the interesting things about the Eddas when it comes to reconstruction is that a lot of these gods, goddesses, Valkyries, all of these entities are only listed in the Eddas and nowhere else. And along with a lot of specific myths are only listed and only described in the Poetic Edda or the Prose Edda, nowhere else, in the way that they're told in the Prose Edda anyway. So that's always kind of a tricky thing to deal with as far as reconstruction goes, just because you never really know. Are you doing the right one? Or are you doing the wrong one? Does it matter?
Having sources to cross-reference is always preferable, but we're not often afforded that luxury.
No, we can dream. We can dream.
Yes.
Yeah. We can dream. For sure. We can dream.
Another interesting way we can use the Prose Edda, the Hatatal, which is how I'm going to continue pronouncing it until I am corrected.
Okay.
Discusses the poetic forms of traditional skaldic poetry, and it can be worth diving in. It's dry, to say the least.
Yes, it is. It's very dry.
It's a poetry manual, and there are very specific ways in which skaldic poetry is to be written. But if you understand the styles and conventions in skaldic poetry, it can possibly help you to interpret the poetic recordings of the myths and the other surviving bits of skaldic poetry that we have with a more discerning eye. Because you will understand, what they're going for and the way in which it's said. So you know what is being taken figuratively.
You'll be more familiar with those patterns.
Yeah, exactly. You can spot the patterns.
All of this sort of brings up the idea of mythic literalism.
Yes.
And taking myths too literally. And we wind up with some weird shit happening. And we wind up with people thinking there is only one correct way to do a heathen thing, or to see a heathen god or goddess or entity or whatever. And that's not the case at all.
Not at all. No. It's important to understand how to apply your understanding of bias in the sources as it relates to your praxis. Because if we do take the myths too rigidly, we wind up bringing a historically biased telling and understanding that will color our interactions with the gods. For example, in a Christian retelling, just like Balder appeared to be a stand-in for Jesus, or could be interpreted that way, Christianity kind of needs a devil figure.
Mm-hmm.
And Loki kind of got the brunt of that. We will have more to say about Loki in a future episode. There's a lot to go in there, but he's a lot more complicated figure than a lot of people give him credit for just by a surface level reading of the myths.
Oh, yeah. 100%. Very complicated. There's layers there.
Trickster figures, if you want to use that term, are common throughout a bunch of mythologies, and they're not always seen as evil. They're, often they bring gifts to humanity or to the gods, and that is what Loki did. He did actually, good came out of it. And so you can see kind of from an earlier non-Christianized perspective where that wouldn't have been viewed as an evil thing. He would have just been mischievous, or it was just his nature to be a little wild.
Yeah. He comes in, he fucks something up, and he's like, oh, I fucked it up. Here's a big, strong hammer.
Yeah, he fixes it. But it's also good to note that he does sometimes fix problems he didn't cause.
True.
Like when Thor had his hammer stolen by the giant who wanted to marry Freya.
Yes.
That was not Loki's doing.
Such a good story.
It was not Loki's doing, but he comes up with a solution and goes with Thor to get his hammer back.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, it's just the whole idea of like this orthodox heathenry bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, there is no one way to be heathen ever. Like, there never has been. There never will be. If people like us have anything to say about it.
we don't even heathen the same way all the time.
Oh no, not even a little. I mean, well, there's a little bit, but
little.
it's very different. If you only looked at the Prose Edda and took it literally, you wouldn't have any of the nuance and the storytelling that is from a lot of the other myths, like from the Poetic Edda, or even like Saxo Grammaticus, or some of the other sources we have that are really interesting sources and tell you a lot about the culture and the society and the religion, even if you have to read between the lines a little bit.
The sagas.
Yeah, I mean, like, because there's a lot of places that you can't find this information anywhere else but in the Prose Edda. Like, the story of the death of Balder. Snorri's Edda is the only source we have where the story was told this way. And, like, mistletoe, they didn't have mistletoe. I don't think.
I was not aware of that.
I need to double check that.
Is that the case?
Let me find it. In my book. I'm going to do it right now. Because that's going to drive me nuts. If we leave it in and I'm wrong, I'm going to be so pissed. Mistletoe, 128. Okay. This is why you keep your books handy. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Snorri apparently had no idea what mistletoe was. It doesn't grow in Iceland. It's very rare in Norway. It's not even really a tree. It's a parasitic, like, vine kind of a thing.
I've always wondered how you make a dart out of mistletoe.
I don't know. But it was likely he found the word mistletoe because the name is called Mistelstein in Icelandic, and other words that end in tine, T or tane. I don't know. I don't speak Icelandic. It could be translated as Valkyrie sword. Of course, Snorri's gonna pick a plant called Valkyrie sword. Like, that's fucking badass.
That would make sense.
But it's the only place that we know where that's a story that happened that way. Like, we don't know.
No, Saxo Grammaticus, we were talking about him earlier, he covers it differently. Of course, in that story, Balder is not a god, but a human. But he does that with every deity he encounters, where Odin is just this weird wizard dude. But yeah, I believe it's a dispute it's a dispute over a love interest, and there's a duel, and Balder is killed.
Yeah, well, Balder is apparently the most beautiful of all the gods.
Yes, but Loki's nowhere to be found in that story, interestingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, mythic literalism is a problem, and it's the same gripe that I have with biblical literalists. You're taking one source and you're saying that source, which was created by man, is infallible and the truth with a capital T.
You can't.
You can't prove that. You can't. Yeah, it makes me crazy. But as far as other reconstruction stuff goes with the Prose Edda, basic ideas about honor and oaths and how some politics were carried out to a degree are really some interesting things you can find in the Prose Edda. I want to keep calling it the Poetic Edda.
No,
it's
totally
not.
Different thing.
It's a totally different thing. So you've got some less religious practice related stuff and more cultural stuff that can still be really relevant to Reconstruction with some critical thinking and some inference and some further research. Like everything in heathenry, further research is needed. It's important for new heathens to read the Prose Edda because it's one of the oldest surviving records of these myths, and it had such far-reaching influence on the myths as we know them. That's why new heathens just starting out are almost always pointed at the prose and poetic Eddas to start out with, because they are the absolute foundation, ground level myth stuff that we have available to us. Do you have any final thoughts on anything?
Snorri's a weirdo.
Snorri's a weirdo.
It's good to cross-check different translations of something when it's available. I do not own a copy, but I have heard good things about Larrington's translation. We didn't go over it today because it's not available for free, and we wanted to talk about sources that you would immediately have access to.
Yes.
But I've heard Larrington is a good one. And you can check the different translators' notes. They'll give you an idea of why they translate things the way they do, what the considerations are. A lot of times they will admit when a word is kind of iffy and they're just kind of going with a judgment call there. So it can give you some insight into all of that. So yeah, always cross-reference whenever possible.
Yes. So that's about all we have for this episode. Hopefully it helped to give a better understanding of the Prose Edda and why it's so important to heathen reconstructionists. As usual, links to sources and further reading are in the episode description, so check those out if you're so inclined. And we will see you in the next episode.
And remember, cite your sources, label your UPG, and always question everything. See you next time.